mandatory labeling of GMO foods in 50 other countries, and in many other countries there are significant restrictions or outright bans on their production and sale. We are in a really unique situation. We're one of the only developed countries in the world where GMOs are in our food unlabeled, and not only that, they are in most of our food. It's a basic right to know what's in our food and make choices about what we're eating. And again, in most places around the world, people have that. And there have been, basically since GMOs were introduced, there have been efforts to get mandatory labeling and to stop GMOs. And in this country, they have never gotten very far.
The number of NGOs that have been working on this issue in different ways and in different forms, whether it be the Center for Food Safety, the OCA, the OTA, numerous NGOs that are putting efforts towards raising awareness about GMOs in our food, then also taking numerous approaches. And I think many of you have probably heard and seen some of the challenges inside of the industry, say with the OCA's position on some of this as well. And it's our opinion overall that it's such an important issue that every single way that we can approach this is important, whether it be through the work of the Just Labeling It Organic Voices that is taking place right now, the work that the NonGMO Project is doing, the work that the Center for Food Safety is doing, the work that the OCA is doing, and that it's really important for all of us to always be continually speaking the message internally that our resources need to go towards putting energy into affecting this issue with biotechnology versus with what the right way, exact right way to do it is as an organic, natural industry. And I think it's an important thing to keep in mind because we're pretty small in comparison to them overall. Basically, we have the right to know and we want our government to do something about it. So I would just ask if you only take one thing away from this is keep in mind that as an industry, we all need to work on this issue in our own ways.
So part of why I like to always include some information about what are GMOs is that there is a lot of intentional misinformation out there. Biotechnology companies want people to think that genetic modification is the same as hybridization, is the same as other techniques that have been used for hundreds of years. And because of that, I'm sure some of you have experienced people walk into a grocery store and think that everything in the produce aisle is genetically modified. When in fact there's actually a relatively small handful of crops, and we'll look at that next. So when we're talking about genetic modification or genetic engineering, we're talking about a very specific process that involves gene splicing in a laboratory. And through this process, DNA from different species is combined. So you end up with combinations of plant, animal, bacteria, and viral genes that do not occur in nature, are not possible through traditional breeding. For example, one of the first GMOs was a tomato where they spliced genes from an Arctic flounder fish into the tomato. So obviously that is not something that would happen in a farmer's greenhouse or out in the wild. Very new and kind of freaky. There's concern about the actual process with gene splicing because basically it's a very simplified approach where they treat DNA like a static set of building blocks where you can just splice in one set of genes with a desired trait and you'll only change the DNA in that one way. That's the premise of genetic engineering. But the reality is DNA is incredibly complex, and when you manipulate it in one place, it has effects elsewhere. What we're seeing with genetic engineering is that when genes are spliced in, genes other places in the DNA get turned off or get turned on through that process. New proteins can be created, which is why there are some concerns about GMOs and novel allergens. So there's basically a lot that we don't understand yet about the impacts of this process. And that's the bottom line, is that until and unless it can be better understood and proven safe, it should be kept in a laboratory. So this is 2010 production figures. So like I said, this is a relatively small handful of things, but these are key commodity crops. Corn and soy especially are used in most of our processed food. A couple of notes here. First of all, this is what is intentionally planted in GMO form. But because of pollen drift and other kinds of unintentional contamination, there is, unfortunately, much less than, for example, 14% of our corn in this country that is still truly non-GMO. So that's one issue here. One thing I'd like to point out is that wheat is not on this list, and I would say that is the #1 thing that people think is genetically engineered that is not. Of course, they are really pushing to introduce commercial GMO wheat because it is another key commodity crop. Up till now, there's been a fair amount of resistance from the wheat trade groups, I think largely because of the types of products that wheat is used in, which especially, they have this kind of bread and cookies and all of that. As you see, though, there is some GMO Hawaiian papaya, zucchini, summer squash, and also sweet corn, but that's basically it for the produce aisle. There have in the past been commercially produced GM tomatoes and potatoes, but both of those were pulled from the market pretty quickly. So that's the 2010 figures. Alfalfa is a new one on there.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment really quickly on that sugar beet number, because sugar beets have not been in the system very long, and it pretty rapidly took over. So I think that's one thing to be really paying attention to, and now that they've deregulated alfalfa, we suspect that it won't take very long for that number to be looking the same.
So again, because especially corn and soy, and I'm sure lots of you have seen King Corn, or even if you haven't, understand that we have ridiculous amounts of subsidies for corn in this country. We have way too much of it, and therefore we need to find ways to put it into just about everything. So with most of our corn being genetically modified, that means that most of our processed food has genetically modified ingredients in it. So this is conventional processed food. Natural and organic is a bit different. We'll talk more about organic in a couple of minutes, but on the natural part, as I'm sure you all are aware, there are no regulations for making a natural claim, so a natural product could be just as at risk for having GMO contamination as a conventional product, unless the manufacturer is part of the NonGMO Project and has made efforts to keep GMOs out. And we're inundated with a lot of PR message from the biotech lobby about how GMOs are going to fix every problem in the world, and it's what everyone is doing. And in fact, if you take a step back and look at GMO production worldwide, in the US, we grow as many GMOs almost as every other country in the world combined. So we are in a really specific context with the prevalence of GMOs, and again, the fact that they are not labeled. And I think it's instructive to ask why. Why are so many countries not interested in this technology? Why are so many countries not growing it or not allowing it to be imported? So first of all, on GMO traits. 3/4 of all of the GMO crops grown worldwide are engineered for herbicide tolerance. So what that means is these crops, for example, the Roundup Ready crops, you plant a Roundup Ready seed, and in the past, where you had to spot apply herbicide and carefully avoid getting it on your crops, otherwise they would die just the same way a weed dies when it's sprayed. Now with these Roundup Ready crops, whole fields of Roundup Ready seeds can be planted, and in theory, you can spray the whole field with Roundup, and the Roundup Ready crops will live and the weeds will die. So this is the vast majority of GMOs that are being grown are engineered for this trait. There are a couple of major problems with this. First of all, as a result of this technology, the use of glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in herbicides like Roundup, has gone up 15 times since GMOs were introduced. And the reason I want to emphasize that is because the biotech companies like to present GMOs as some kind of alternative to chemical agriculture, and as crazy as it sounds, like it's somehow environmentally friendly. And it's really important to understand that the chemical companies and the biotech companies are the same. The world's biggest chemical companies are also the world's biggest biotech companies, and they're also unfortunately becoming the world's biggest seed companies because they're buying up all of the smaller seed companies. So there's this huge issue with the increased use of Roundup, which is of course polluting soil and water and animals, and of course getting on all of the food. The other huge problem with Roundup Ready crops is that the weeds are becoming resistant also. And there is now a superweed epidemic that has gotten to such proportions that it's being covered in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Conventional mainstream farmer groups are saying this is the biggest threat we've seen in farm country in decades, because what's happening is farmers are paying a premium for these very expensive genetically engineered seeds. They're buying 15 times more herbicide than they were before, and it's not working. So then they're having to go back and buy additional herbicides like 2,4-D and go back to spot applying and more labor-intensive methods. So again, in the context of why so many countries aren't growing them, when you look at the technology, there's really a lot to be desired. The majority of the remaining GM crops are engineered to produce Bt in their DNA. And Bt is an insecticide. It's actually an OMRI-listed insecticide. It's not necessarily so bad as a spray-on insecticide. But with Bt crops, that insecticide is present in every single cell of the plant. So this is theoretically food that has a registered insecticide in every single bite of it. So there's obvious concerns there about human safety. I'll point out here that there have been no long-term studies done on the effects of consuming any of these GMO crops on human beings. We are the experiment right now. And there's also environmental problems with Bt crops, because research is starting to show that with that high concentration, it's starting to get into all the rivers and streams around the crops. The Bt is getting into the rivers and streams around the crops, around the fields where these crops are grown. So that's basically it. That's what we have. After 30 years and billions of dollars in research, the biotech industry has brought us herbicide resistance and insecticide production. There are no GM traits in commercial production for increased yields, drought tolerance, or improved nutrition. You hear a lot about these things as a theoretical, and if you look carefully at the wording in the ads where, Monsanto had an ad, how to squeeze more food out of a raindrop. They don't directly lie and say GM crops are drought tolerant, but the implication is really strong, right? Most people that look at that think, oh, that's what GMOs are all about. They're about drought tolerance. They're about producing more food. They're about producing better, more nutritious food. So that's the shiny gloss that's on them, but when you get down to the facts and look at what they've actually brought to market and what's actually being grown, it is simply an excellent business model for chemical companies to sell more chemicals and to sell expensive seeds. And just to put that in context, this is an actual ad from Time magazine, June 1947. The great expectations for DDT have been realized. During 1946, exhaustive tests have shown that when properly used, DDT is a benefactor of all humanity. The reason this is up here, and some of you may know, that the same company who created DDT, Monsanto, is also the #1 GMO biotech company. And they are saying the same thing about GMOs. So we really, when we consider how safe they are, how much we can trust them, we need to look at this history and this context. And, it raises some serious red flags. And I'd like to just point out also that it took 30 years from when Rachel Carson published Silent Spring until DDT was finally banned. One of the big problems with GMOs is that not enough research has been done. And there are a number of reasons for that. Most of the valid research that we have is coming out of other countries. And I'll just touch quickly on this first one, the reproductive issues. Part of why I think this is important is that biotech will say, look, everyone's been eating GMOs for over 10 years in the US and they're all fine. So a couple of issues. One, obviously, we are not exactly a picture of health as a nation, and I'm not blaming that all on GMOs, but we don't know to what extent GMOs might be part of it. But more importantly, we are still in the first generation of this experiment, and we don't know the impact that consuming GMOs may have on fertility. There are some recent studies, one that was commissioned by the Austrian government a couple of years ago, one last year that was done in Russia. Both showed that one used hamsters and the other mice, and in both studies, by the second generation, the animals who had been consuming GMO food had fewer offspring, smaller offspring, and lower survival rates of their offspring. So there's obviously some real question there, and how many of you have seen The Future of Food? Okay, good audience. Okay, so this is review, I'm sure, for a lot of you, but do you remember that part where they're talking to a Japanese scientist about why they don't grow GMOs in Japan? And what he says is, we are going to watch the children in your country for the next 10 years before we make a decision. Yeah, it's funny, but also sad and scary. But I think it sums it up really well. Again, we are really unique for being a developed country with supposed democracy and all these rights, and we're part of this huge, unprecedented experiment that no one else in the world is really letting themselves be subject to in the same way.
Megan, I want to make a quick comment on that. You guys heard about the GE salmon this morning. I always think it's really funny when I see, well, not funny, but sad and a real eye-opener when you see an ad that says, GE salmon for human consumption. As soon as we have to put for human consumption after our food, like, shouldn't that kind of tell us something? It's an interesting juxtaposition.
Again, the other major reason why so many countries are not using GMOs is because of consumer resistance. In Europe, any product that has more than 0.9% GMO has to be labeled. And people there basically don't want to eat GMOs and have demanded that that labeling be in place. And as a result, very few GMOs are grown, very few GMOs are imported or sold there at all. In the US, on the other hand, even though the vast majority, poll after poll, shows that upwards of 90% of Americans are in favor of mandatory labeling. And in a New York Times CBS poll a couple of years ago, they asked, would you eat GMOs? And 53% of people said no. They explained to them, presumably, here's what a GMO is, would you eat that? And 53% of people said no. So that's really sad, because probably pretty much every single one of those people ate GMOs that day and just had no idea that they were eating them and that they were in the food unlabeled. A lot of countries have done a better job than the US with giving consumers the information they're looking for, and I do think that that's really starting to shift here with all of the efforts the last couple of years and culminating in the Right to Know March just ending last week. Like, it feels like there's just such a bigger focus on this issue than there ever has been. And I think that really, if we can get enough people demanding non-GMO and demanding GMO labeling, we can turn the tide here. I will add, though, that part of why the NonGMO Project was created, and I'm going to get into what the NonGMO Project does in just a moment, but we really saw that there was a real lack of receptivity at the federal level to mandatory labeling, and there had been a lot of good work put into trying to get that to happen. It is my personal opinion that it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to ever get meaningful mandatory labeling in this country at this point, because of the fact that GMOs are so incredibly pervasive. And so now it's not only the biotech lobby that's totally committed to keeping GMOs unlabeled, but all of the major conventional food manufacturers also, who don't want this extra burden and cost. And that's basically the context in which we started the NonGMO Project. We decided if the government isn't going to label the things that are GMO, we can at least label the things that are not GMO and have really clear guidelines and requirements in place for being able to make that kind of claim. as Corinne said, it's really important. This is such a huge issue that we do need to be coming at it from all directions, and that's why the NonGMO Project was one of the main organizers for the Right to Know March, and we are supporting the different efforts for mandatory labeling. If nothing else, they raise really valuable awareness and get people to realize, wait, this is already in the food and it's not labeled. But I think it is important that we don't sit around waiting for the government. This was a survey from last fall. Stonyfield talked to about 12,000 consumers, all of whom purchased organic food at least once a week. And 81% of them said that they purchased organic food specifically to avoid GMOs. 28% said avoiding GMOs is the main reason they buy organic. That backs up similar statistics from 2009. The Organic Trade Association and Kiwi did a study. Clearly, consumers expect that organic is non-GMO, and that's really important. And this is another reason why the project was created. Because the fact is that although GMOs are an excluded method under the National Organic Program, and of course, as we all know, GMO avoidance is a central tenet of organic, there are no thresholds set in the NOP, and there is no testing required for GMOs in order to be certified organic. The USDA also has been very clear that if there is unintentional GMO contamination, that will not result in the loss of certification, which makes sense, right? Because you've got a farmer who's done everything right and some pollen blows into their field and it's not their fault. But in the context of what consumers are expecting the products to be, there's a real problem. And so basically, the project was created largely because of this gap between consumer expectation and market reality. We've been looking at, organic specifically the last few slides, but consumers have similar expectations of natural. I'm sure many of you are aware that when people walk into your store, a lot of them just assume everything in here is non-GMO. It's really important that we maintain trust in organic. Organic certification is the most comprehensive and the most rigorous agriculture certification in the world. It covers lots of things. And it covers things that non-GMO project verification doesn't. We are specifically looking at GMOs. We're not looking at were there pesticides used, were there chemical fertilizers used. And so my personal gold standard is certified organic and non-GMO project verified, because then I know that the best practices possible were followed for in terms of pesticides, fertilizers, and also that all of the risk ingredients in the product were tested. So
I want to just talk to that really quickly, Megan. Megan brings up a really big point here. One of the reasons that INFRA as an association and our members who govern us and drive us got behind this issue 100% is just because of that key factor of what our consumers expect when they walk into our stores. And really, if not everyone in this room isn't really angry about this issue and isn't trying to do everything they possibly can to educate their consumers about it, our opportunity gap is going to close pretty rapidly. And Megan's going to talk more about how the project is designed, but I think this is a good time to reinforce the fact that the last thing we want to have happen as retailers is have some big New York Times headline that splashes up and says, oh, guess what, folks, and there's GMOs in organic too. There's already a lot of consumer confusion between natural and organic out there, and this is would just create a whole bunch more, as well as erode the trust, which is what really differentiates all of you from your competitors.
So just a little bit about what the NonGMO Project actually does. So we're very focused on practical solutions, and we specifically have a market-based approach. So again, while there are really important organizations like the Center for Food Safety doing invaluable litigation on this, other organizations educating people about the health dangers, working on policy, we are specifically focusing for now within the natural and organic products industry, and because we believe that if given a choice, people will choose a non-GMO product. And so we believe that we can change the entire marketplace in this way. So the core components of what we have are, first of all, a consensus-based standard of best practices for GMO avoidance. This standard was first presented for public comment in 2007. We have been going through 2 public comments a year ever since that. It's about 35 pages long. It's available on our website. I know now you all want to go download it and read it. Doesn't it sound exciting? We have a standards committee actually that is a great stakeholder group that handles taking in the public comment and making the revisions, because it is work that's not for everyone. But on our website there is also just a nice 1-page summary of some of the core components if you want to get an idea of it, and we'll talk about those briefly too. So we have the only standard, the only third-party standard in North America for GMO avoidance, and also the only third-party verification program. So what our program does, it's similar to organic certification, that we look at how a product is produced and require that it meet the our standards.